Few names in American entertainment shine as brightly as Dolly Parton. A legendary singer, songwriter, producer, actress, and philanthropist, she rose from a small cabin in rural Tennessee to become one of the most influential figures in country music history. With timeless hits, award-winning albums, and a career spanning more than 5 decades, Dolly Parton has built an empire defined by talent, resilience, and unmistakable charm. But behind the glittering rhinestones and radiant smile lies a story far more complex. What sacrifices shaped her journey? What quiet sorrows hid beneath the spotlight? In this video, we look beyond the fame to explore the sad life chapters that tested her strength and defined her spirit. Stay with us as we uncover the untold emotions behind the icon. Born on January 19, 1946, in a one-room cabin along the Little Pigeon River in Locust Ridge, Sevier County, Tennessee, Dolly Parton entered a world defined by hardship. She was the 4th of 12 children born to Robert Lee Parton, a tobacco farmer and construction worker, and Avie Lee Owens Parton. The wooden cabin had no electricity, no running water, and no insulation strong enough to keep out the bitter Appalachian winters. Neighbors later recalled how smoke from the small wood stove curled through the cold air, the only source of warmth for a household of 14. The family's poverty was not a passing phase, but a daily reality. Dolly has openly shared that her father paid the doctor who delivered her with a sack of cornmeal because there was no cash to offer. In interviews decades later, she described how 3 or 4 children shared a single bed layered under thin quilts stitched by her mother. Water had to be carried from a nearby spring. Bathing was done in metal tubs, and kerosene lamps replaced what electricity couldn't provide. School offered little escape from the stigma of poverty. Classmates sometimes noticed her homemade dresses, sewn from flour sacks, and the worn shoes passed down through siblings. Yet even then, there were signs of a spirit unwilling to be dimmed. Teachers at Sevier County High School reportedly remembered her volunteering to sing during morning assemblies, her voice echoing through modest auditoriums long before national stages awaited her. One of the most harrowing childhood incidents occurred when Dolly was still very young. A broken piece of glass severely cut 3 of her toes. With no money for hospital treatment and limited access to medical care in rural Tennessee during the early 1950s, her mother acted immediately. Using kerosene as a disinfectant and a sewing needle with thread, she stitched the wounds at the kitchen table. The pain, Dolly later admitted, was unforgettable, but so was the lesson in resilience. That moment reflected the stark reality of life in the Smoky Mountains, where survival often depended on ingenuity rather than resources. Relatives have since revealed that young Dolly would often sing to lift the spirits of her siblings during especially difficult winters, when food was scarce and her father's work was uncertain. Cornbread, beans, and whatever vegetables they could grow formed the backbone of most meals. Yet music, rooted deeply in her mother's Appalachian folk traditions, filled the cabin with something poverty could not erase: hope. These early years in rural Tennessee were marked by deprivation, but they also shaped the determination and emotional depth that would later define her songwriting. Behind the global icon stood a child who understood hunger, cold nights, and sacrifice long before she understood fame. The hardship of Dolly Parton's childhood did not end with hunger or cold winters. As the years moved forward in Sevier County, loss entered the small cabin with a silence far heavier than poverty. In 1955, when Dolly was just 9 years old, her mother gave birth to a baby boy named Larry. In a household where older children naturally became caregivers, young Dolly was entrusted with helping watch over the newborn. Family members later shared that she took the responsibility with unusual seriousness, cradling him gently, humming mountain lullabies she had learned from her mother. For a brief moment, amid the noise of 12 siblings and the strain of rural life, there was a fragile sense of joy. But that joy lasted only 4 days. Larry passed away shortly after his birth, a tragedy that shook the Parton family deeply. In the isolated Appalachian community of the mid-1950s, medical access remained limited, and infant mortality was not uncommon. Still, statistics offered no comfort. For Dolly, the loss was intensely personal. She later described feeling as though she had lost her own baby, carrying a quiet guilt that lingered long into adulthood. Relatives have recalled how she withdrew into herself for weeks, spending time alone near the river, singing softly as if searching for answers in the hills that had always surrounded her. Years later, when she wrote and recorded deeply emotional gospel songs, those close to her believed echoes of Larry's memory could be heard in her voice. In interviews across the 1970s and 1980s, Dolly rarely spoke publicly about the depth of that early wound, but in more reflective conversations decades later, she acknowledged how the experience shaped her sense of responsibility and compassion. It was a defining moment. The child who had already known deprivation now understood grief. Time carried her far beyond Locust Ridge. On May 30th, 1966, she married Carl Dean in Ringgold, Georgia, beginning a partnership that would last nearly 6 decades. Carl remained largely outside the spotlight, choosing privacy over publicity, while Dolly's career soared from Nashville's Grand Ole Opry stages to international fame. Those who knew them described their relationship as steady and grounded, a quiet anchor amid the whirlwind of touring schedules and public appearances. Then, in March 2025, another profound loss arrived. Carl Dean passed away at the age of 82. The news, confirmed by close representatives, marked the end of a 50-plus-year marriage that had weathered fame, distance, and time itself. Friends noted that Dolly stepped back from public engagements in the weeks that followed. Studio sessions were postponed. For someone whose creativity had rarely paused since her teenage years in Nashville, the silence was noticeable. Sources close to her shared that grief affected her health during that period. Accustomed to caring for others and pouring herself into work, she reportedly struggled to maintain routines, skipping meals, and withdrawing from daily activities. The woman who once lifted her siblings' spirits during hard winters now faced a solitude unfamiliar in its depth. Observers said she leaned on faith and family, much as she had in childhood, drawing strength from the same spiritual roots planted in the Smoky Mountains. In quiet reflections given in 2025, Dolly spoke gently about Carl's enduring presence in her life, describing him as her home in a world constantly in motion. The loss echoed differently from childhood grief, yet it reopened the same emotional landscape, love intertwined with absence, memory intertwined with music. Across decades, from the tiny cabin in Tennessee to global stages, the thread of family remained central. And when family was lost, the impact resonated through every note she sang and every pause between them. The grief that followed Carl Dean's passing in 2025 seemed to reopen older wounds that had first surfaced decades earlier, during one of the most fragile chapters of Dolly Parton's life. Long before the world saw her as an unstoppable force of optimism, she had quietly battled profound physical and emotional pain. In 1984, at the height of her career, Dolly underwent a partial hysterectomy after being diagnosed with endometriosis. At the time, she was 38 years old and living between Nashville and Los Angeles, balancing recording sessions, film commitments, and business ventures. Endometriosis, a painful condition in which tissue similar to the uterine lining grows outside the uterus, had reportedly caused her years of severe discomfort. Symptoms she initially concealed to avoid disrupting her demanding schedule. Those close to her later revealed that she often pushed through rehearsals and studio recordings despite intense pain, masking it with the same bright composure audiences had come to expect. The surgery, performed in Nashville, brought medical relief, but carried irreversible consequences. It meant she would never be able to carry a child. For someone who had grown up in a large, tightly bonded family and who once described herself as naturally maternal, the emotional toll was significant. In later interviews, Dolly spoke candidly about the deep sadness she experienced, admitting that the loss felt like a private bereavement. While she and Carl Dean had never publicly announced plans for children, the finality of the decision, no longer a choice but a medical reality, left her confronting a quiet but lasting grief. The mid-1980s also marked a period of intense professional transition. Following the success of films such as 9 to 5 and a string of chart-topping hits, public expectations were soaring. Behind the scenes, however, sources close to her at the time described exhaustion and emotional strain. The convergence of physical recovery, hormonal shifts following surgery, and mounting career pressures contributed to a period of depression she would later openly acknowledge. In a rare moment of vulnerability shared years afterward, Dolly revealed that during one particularly dark period in the mid-1980s, she contemplated ending her life. She described sitting alone in her Nashville home, overwhelmed by feelings of failure and emptiness. What interrupted that moment, she said, was the sudden appearance of her small dog, Popeye, whose unexpected presence startled her back into awareness. She interpreted it as a sign, an emotional interruption that broke the spiral of despair. The firearm was set aside. The crisis passed, but the memory remained. Mental health conversations were far less common in public discourse during that era, particularly within the country music industry. Yet Dolly's later decision to speak about her experience added a new dimension to her public image. It revealed a woman who, despite fame and fortune, was not immune to despair. Colleagues have since noted that her songwriting during the late 1980s and early 1990s carried deeper emotional textures, lyrics reflecting vulnerability, spiritual searching, and resilience forged through private battles. Medical experts have also pointed out that endometriosis can significantly affect emotional well-being, particularly when combined with life-altering surgery. In retrospect, those years represent not just a health crisis, but a turning point. Dolly gradually redirected her nurturing instincts outward, expanding her philanthropic efforts, most notably through initiatives like the Imagination Library, founded in 1995 in Sevier County. While she has never framed that work as a replacement for motherhood, observers have long sensed that her desire to uplift children around the world carried echoes of what might have been. Through physical pain, depression, and moments of profound doubt, she continued performing, recording, and appearing before audiences who saw only strength. Yet beneath the sequins and stage lights was a woman learning, slowly and deliberately, how to survive not just poverty and loss, but the silent battles of the body and mind. When we look at Dolly Parton today, it's easy to see the sparkle, the legendary voice, and the global success. But behind that brilliance is a woman who has endured poverty, heartbreaking loss, health struggles, and moments of deep emotional darkness. Her journey reminds us that even the strongest smiles can hide untold pain, and that resilience is often born from the hardest chapters of life. If her story has touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on the quiet strength it represents. Compassion matters. Understanding matters. No matter how famous or successful someone may seem, they are still human, still vulnerable, still capable of hurting. Let Dolly's journey inspire us to treat others with kindness, to check in on the people we love, and to never underestimate the power of hope. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful stories that remind us of courage, empathy, and the true value of the human spirit.